It happened in a meeting room that smelled faintly of coffee and disappointment. Brenda stood near the back, her son slumped against her chest, fever burning through the fabric of her blouse. She hadn't meant to bring him. The daycare had closed without warning. His breathing had grown ragged by morning, and no one else had answered the phone. She thought if she kept him quiet, if she stayed out of the way, no one would mind. They did. Her manager didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This is a place of business," he said, gesturing toward the child as though pointing out spilled coffee. "We can't make exceptions." No one spoke up. Not a single coworker shifted in their seat. Not even a glance of sympathy. The silence was the verdict. So she left. Out into the gray afternoon, the kind where rain doesn't fall, it hovers, pressing in like breath against a window. Brenda walked quickly, her son wrapped in her coat, his face buried in her neck. His skin was damp, hot. She had no umbrella, no job, no next step, just her arms around him. And the words she kept whispering under her breath, again and again. The morning chill didn't sting, it settled, like dust, like doubt. Brenda pulled her coat tighter, the zipper long broken, the lining worn thin. In her other hand she held a manila folder that had become her companion, her confession, her last defense. Inside were 10 copies of the same resume, printed weeks ago at a public library. The ink had started to fade. The words hadn't changed. She walked. Corner store to corner cafe, nail salon to neighborhood grocer. Any place with a "now hiring" sign in the window. She entered with shoulders squared, voice ready, smile rehearsed. But what do rehearsals matter when the ending never changes? It always started the same. Polite, curious, sometimes even kind. "You've worked before." Of course, yes, cleaning, inventory, night shifts. She didn't stumble, didn't over-explain, until they saw the line she couldn't erase. Reason for leaving last job. Terminated. And that's where the air shifted. Smiles grew polite in a different way, curtains closing politely at the end of a funeral. One man folded the application before she finished speaking. "We're looking for someone a little more stable," he said, without irony, while her son sat coughing in the corner, clutching an empty inhaler. She left each place quieter than she had entered. She never told them the reason for that word, that wound. How a conference room had turned into a courtroom, her boss's voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This is not a daycare, Brenda." How no one spoke up. How she had held her child in her arms as she walked out, into a gray drizzle that felt like the world had turned its back, too. But the world doesn't pause for explanation. So she kept walking. By the third week, she stopped into a pawn shop with the last thing of value she owned, an engagement ring. Tarnished, tucked in a sock drawer for 2 years, ever since Mateo's father disappeared like unpaid rent. The man behind the counter didn't ask questions. He examined it under dull light, offered a number low enough to make her flinch. She took it anyway. It paid for bread, rice, 2 cans of soup, and a half dose of the cheapest asthma medicine available without insurance. She held it to Mateo's lips like it was holy. That night, they found shelter in the back restroom of a gas station. Brenda cleaned the bench with tissues and warm water from the sink. She laid out their blanket, thin but still familiar. She wrapped Mateo in her coat and whispered, "Just breathe, baby. Just one good night." He didn't answer. He was too tired. But he leaned into her. The fluorescent light above them buzzed and flickered, casting their shadows on the stained tiles. She watched them, those ghost-like outlines on the wall. One tall, one small, both waiting. Somewhere between midnight and morning, she stopped counting rejections. Not because they didn't hurt, but because they had begun to lose their edges. They weren't cuts anymore, just cold. And still each dawn she rose. She brushed Mateo's curls with her fingers, tied her shoes, folded the manila folder. The knock came just after sunrise, 3 soft raps, a pause, then again. Brenda blinked awake on the thin mattress laid across the floor. Mateo was still asleep, curled into her side, his breath finally steady. She moved gently, trying not to wake him. When she opened the door, Mrs. Maria stood there with a paper in her hand and a plastic bag dangling from her wrist. The older woman was in her usual worn slippers, her floral headscarf tied tight against the morning wind. Lavender and boiled rice clung to her like memory. "I brought you something," she said in Spanish, voice rough from sleep but kind. Brenda accepted the flyer. It was wrinkled at the edges, printed in black and white. Now hiring janitorial staff, no diploma required. The logo was simple, a modest building with clean lettering, Solis Rivera. They clean office buildings, afternoon shifts. "It's not glamorous, but it's steady," Maria said, glancing at the room behind Brenda, at the small boy wrapped in blankets, his cheeks still too pale. "They're run by our people. Maybe they understand." Brenda's throat tightened. She whispered thank you. Maria just nodded and handed her the bag. Inside were 2 boiled eggs, a handful of rice, and a small apple, split in 2. Later that morning, Brenda sat in the waiting room of the company's office, her fingers pressed against the manila folder like it might float away if she let go. Mateo sat beside her, his sketchbook balanced on his knees, drawing a lopsided superhero with a bright yellow cape. The room smelled faintly of lemon and floor polish. The receptionist handed Brenda a form. Simple questions. Name, contact, work history, and then it came, the line she dreaded. "Have you ever been terminated from a previous job?" Her pen hovered. Her mouth felt dry. She glanced at Mateo. He was coughing again, soft and sharp, the way that made her heart jump even though she was used to it by now. He didn't notice her looking. He was too busy shading in the sky behind his hero. She turned back to the form. Yes. She marked the box with a trembling stroke, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper. There it was, truth in permanent black. She slid the form forward and sat back, heart thudding. Nothing happened. No one gasped. No doors slammed. The receptionist simply smiled and said, "Thank you." Brenda nodded, but inside her, something collapsed and braced at once. Like holding your breath underwater and hoping the surface is still close. She didn't expect a call back. She didn't dare, but she had filled it out. She had told the truth. The air inside the office lobby was still, the kind of quiet built not by design but by routine. A vending machine in the corner hummed softly, half-stocked. Plastic chairs lined one wall, 3 of them, identical, too firm to comfort. Brenda sat in the middle one, back straight despite the ache in her shoulders. Her coat was buttoned to the top, but the cold had already settled beneath it. Mateo leaned into her side, legs swinging, a half-drawn superhero on his lap. The yellow crayon had broken, so he used the orange to finish the cape. She didn't say anything. You learn to let little things go when survival takes the lead. The receptionist behind the window had smiled politely when Brenda handed in her form. "Someone will be with you shortly," she had said, then disappeared behind a door that hadn't opened since. Brenda counted the tiles on the floor, watched the clock, silently recited the list of what they needed that week. Bread, milk, his medicine, bus fare. She was halfway through calculating how far she could stretch the last $20 when the elevator doors slid open. She didn't look up at first, but she noticed Mateo pause, his humming stopping mid-breath. She turned. A man had entered the room, tall, not imposing but steady, charcoal blazer, no tie. Shirt sleeves rolled back just enough to show he didn't mind work. The kind of face that didn't ask for attention but often got it. Silver at the temples, a quiet crease between his brows like he thought often and rarely aloud. He was headed toward the exit, a phone in one hand, but his pace slowed when he saw them. His eyes rested first on Mateo, on the open sketchbook in his lap, then on Brenda. Not with scrutiny, not surprise, it was something gentler, something older, recognition. It wasn't dramatic, just a flicker in his expression, the briefest stillness in his stride, but it held weight. As if, for a breath, her story overlapped with something he'd once lived, something half-buried but never forgotten. He didn't speak, just nodded, slightly, as if to say, "I see you." Then he turned, continued down the hallway, his steps quiet against the linoleum. Brenda didn't move. Her pulse had quickened, though she couldn't say why. She had grown used to being invisible in waiting rooms like this, flattened into forms and file folders. But this man, something about his gaze felt like standing in sunlight after weeks of rain. She looked at Mateo. He was back to coloring now, unconcerned. Just another morning, another hallway, another stranger. But for Brenda, something had shifted. She didn't know his name, didn't know his title or whether he even worked there. But the look he gave her wasn't charity. It wasn't judgment. It was history, and history knows its own. She breathed in deeply, the first full breath in days, not because the waiting was over, but because, for the first time in a long time, it felt like maybe, just maybe. The offer was brief and without ceremony. Brenda received the call on a Tuesday evening while heating water on a single-burner stove. Her fingers were cracked from the cold, her voice raw from using it too little. The woman on the phone didn't ask questions, just said there was a janitorial opening, starting tomorrow, and would Brenda be available. "Yes," she said, too quickly. There was a pause, then a condition. "Your son, he'll have to stay in the break room while you're on shift. Company policy." Brenda gripped the edge of the sink. Her eyes flicked to Mateo, curled on the mattress beside a pile of library books, coughing lightly in his sleep. "That's fine," she said. "We won't be any trouble." The next day she arrived 20 minutes early. She wore her best jeans, scrubbed clean the night before in a public sink. Mateo walked beside her, holding his sketchpad like a shield. His shoes squeaked with each step. The building itself wasn't new, but it was cared for. The kind of place that didn't pretend to be more than it was. The receptionist at the front smiled, real, if a little distracted, and led them down a hallway that smelled of lemon cleaner and warm dust. The break room had 2 tables, a microwave, and a small couch with threads poking out from one arm. Mateo settled quickly, his drawing tools spread like a ritual, and Brenda kissed the top of his head before slipping on a pair of gloves and beginning her shift. Cleaning was not unfamiliar. She knew the rhythm of repetition, the way silence filled in the spaces that conversation used to occupy. She swept, mopped, emptied bins, and wiped glass until her reflection no longer startled her. No one asked about her past. No one mentioned her termination. There were only brief greetings, a few nods, and the quiet kind of respect that says, "You showed up, so did I." On the 4th evening, as the sun turned amber against the office windows, Brenda found Mateo waiting for her with his eyes wide. "Someone left me something," he said, barely above a whisper. On the break room chair sat a plastic bag folded neatly. Inside, a set of colored pencils, 12 sharp points untouched, a children's book about lions in the savannah, and a plush toy, round, golden, eyes kind, mane wild. Brenda reached out as if it might vanish. Was anyone here? Nope, it was just there. No tag, no note, just a gesture, quiet, undemanding. She looked up, half expecting to see someone watching from the hall, but it was empty. Still, somewhere down the corridor, Bruce Rivera stood in shadow near the stairwell. His coat slung over one arm, he watched the mother and son from a distance, not intruding. His face held no smile, just a stillness, as if remembering something he'd kept locked away. He did not step forward, did not explain. Brenda didn't know who had left the gift. But she did know the feeling it brought, the sensation of not being forgotten. It had been raining since morning, persistent, unhurried, the kind of rain that doesn't roar but soaks through everything anyway. Brenda stood beneath the shallow overhang outside the building, holding Mateo close. Her shift had ended 15 minutes ago, but the storm had shown no signs of easing. She had no umbrella. Their thin jackets were already damp from the walk to work that morning. She watched the street, trying to time a break between downpours, but the sky offered none. Mateo coughed once, then again. She wrapped her arms tighter around him. And then a shadow, not thunder, not the hiss of passing cars, but the quiet sound of leather shoes on wet pavement. She looked up. Bruce stood beside them, holding an umbrella, large, black, worn at the edges. He said nothing at first, just tilted it toward them, covering both her and Mateo with a practiced ease. The rain pattered against the fabric like a private rhythm, the kind of sound that makes silence feel safe. Brenda started to speak, to thank him, to apologize, to explain. He stopped her with a single sentence, his voice low, almost as if he were reminding himself. No one who tries that hard deserves to walk in the rain. That was all. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't offer pity. He simply stood there holding the umbrella, sharing the space. Mateo, watching him, said nothing either. But later that night, as Brenda unpacked their things back at the shelter, he pulled a folded sheet from his bag. A drawing. crayons on scrap paper, a tall man holding an umbrella over a mother and her child. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, he had scrawled, "You're like a quiet superhero." The next day, the umbrella was hanging beside the breakroom door, hooked neatly with a note, "For the next rainy day." There was more after that. Small things. A warm lunch left in the staff fridge, labeled with her name. An extra inhaler in the first aid cabinet, same brand Mateo used. A post-it on her locker that simply read, "You're doing better than you think." None of it was signed, none of it acknowledged, but Brenda knew. She recognized care when it came without expectation. And Bruce never brought it up, not once. He passed her in the hallway like he always had, with a nod, a quiet evening, and a glance that didn't pry. But now, when their eyes met, something else lived there. A history shared in fragments, a promise unspoken. Because sometimes the people who change your life don't arrive with noise. They arrive. The company's annual gathering was held in a modest auditorium with white tablecloths and rented chairs, a podium no taller than a child, and banners that fluttered slightly under the weight of the old air conditioning. It was the kind of event that tried to be grand but never quite masked its frugality. And yet that evening the room glowed. Employees dressed slightly better than usual. There was laughter, cautious at first, then full. Brenda sat near the back with Mateo in her lap, his fingers still stained with crayon dust. She had been invited, unexpectedly, with a printed card slid into her locker 2 days prior. She almost didn't come. But Mateo wanted to see the balloons. The lights dimmed. A hush spread like a tide. Bruce stepped up to the microphone. No papers, no teleprompter, just his presence measured and calm. "I wasn't going to speak tonight," he began. "But something's been on my mind." He paused, eyes scanning the room, not searching but anchoring. "When I was 7," he said, "I used to sleep in the supply closet of a hotel while my mother scrubbed floors on the night shift. She didn't have childcare. She didn't have help. So she made a nest for me with towels and mop heads, and I learned to fall asleep to the sound of buckets rolling across tile." The room stilled. "She taught me more about dignity than any degree ever did," he continued. "She showed me what persistence looks like when no one is watching, what strength means when the world calls it inconvenience." He looked toward the back. Not directly at Brenda, but almost. "Tonight, I want to recognize someone who reminded me of her." Whispers rippled. Brenda's spine straightened, breath caught in her chest. Someone who showed up when it was hardest. Who worked quietly, steadily, without complaint. Who held her head high while holding a child in her arms. He gestured for her to stand. She didn't. At first she couldn't, but Mateo nudged her hand. "That's you, Mama." And so she rose. Applause filled the room, not wild, not forced, just full. Bruce waited, then added, almost casually, as if it were nothing at all, "Effective today, Brenda has been promoted to supervisor of our facilities team." Gasps, claps, a few cheers. "And," he continued, "her son Mateo will receive a full educational scholarship, all the way through college, should he choose to go." That was when she cried, not loud, not shaking. Just the quiet kind of cry that begins when something long buried is finally touched with gentleness. It wasn't about the title. It wasn't even about the scholarship. It was the first time she had been seen, not as a burden, not as a file, but as someone who mattered, someone who had survived. Life didn't change overnight. There were still mornings when Brenda woke before dawn, listening for Mateo's breathing, reaching for a worry that wasn't there, then remembering it had shifted. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer screamed. It whispered now, and she had learned to let whispers pass. She still scrubbed floors some evenings, still checked twice that her name was spelled correctly on the shift roster, still waited sometimes for the kindness to be revoked, but it never was. Bruce never brought up the speech. He never reminded her of what he'd done. Instead, he did what he had always done, passed in the hallway with a nod, shared the elevator in silence, offered a gesture of something steady. But things had changed. A container of warm soup left in her locker on the coldest night of the year. A coat that fit Mateo, folded neatly beside a box of cereal. A note, unsigned, in Bruce's distinct block letters. "You're doing better than you think." They never spoke of feelings. No confessions. No declarations. But one evening, after her shift ended late, Brenda found Bruce on the rooftop of the building, overlooking the city's gentle sprawl of lights. He didn't turn when she joined him, just stood with his hands in his pockets, breathing in the air that carried the scent of rain and something faintly sweet from a bakery down the block. "I used to think," he said softly, "that surviving was the only thing that mattered." She didn't interrupt. "But now," he hesitated, "now I think staying, that quiet choosing to stay beside someone, that's braver." She stood beside him without moving closer. The silence was full but not heavy. After a moment, he reached into his coat and handed her a small box. Inside was a bracelet, simple, silver, engraved with one word, "Always." Brenda looked at it, then at him. "I don't need promises," she said. "I know," he replied. "I'm not making one, I'm just staying." She closed the box gently. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But something passed between them in that moment, something louder than any vow. A choosing. Later, as they turned to leave, Mateo appeared from the stairwell, barefoot, sleepy-eyed, clutching his lion toy. "You're smiling," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, you look like a superhero now." She laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from below sorrow, not above it. Bruce bent down, took Mateo's hand without hesitation. And they walked back inside, the three of them. No title, no label, just... The rooftop was quiet, the wind soft. Below them the city exhaled, cars passing, windows glowing, lives continuing in a hum that neither rushed nor waited. It was Saturday evening, that golden hour when the light bends gently and everything feels a little softer, a little more possible. They stood side by side. No music played, no champagne, just the rustle of a breeze that smelled faintly of rain and the creak of the railing beneath their hands. Brenda didn't wear white. Bruce didn't hold a ring. Mateo sat cross-legged near the edge, drawing something in the last page of his sketchpad. Three stick figures under an umbrella, one of them holding a lion. No one made promises. There was no audience, no applause. Only gestures that had already spoken louder than any vow could. A shared umbrella in a storm, A lunch left quietly in a fridge. A bracelet passed from hand to hand without a need for explanation. Love had not knocked on their door like a miracle. It had arrived like a question, will you stay? And day after day, without fanfare, Bruce had answered, yes. They didn't need to define it. Some truths don't require names. Some families are built not on blood but on presence, on being seen at your worst and chosen anyway. Mateo looked up from his drawing. Can we stay here just a little longer? He asked. Brenda smiled, her arm brushing Bruce's. We've got time, she said. They didn't know what came next. Life had never made promises to any of them. But in that stillness, surrounded by nothing but sky and each other, they understood something that many people spend years chasing. That peace doesn't always arrive with perfection. Sometimes it shows up with quiet hands, steady eyes,